Welcome to the People Performance Podcast, where we discuss all things people performance. The People Performance Podcast is made up of 3 series. First up, we have the Leader Lounge episodes with founder of T2, Martin Johnson. Then we have the guest interview episodes. And finally, we have our performance episodes delivered by our very own T2 consultants. If you've listened to our podcast and you want to get in touch and find out a little bit more about what we do or how we can help and support you, reach out via help@trans2performance.com. You can stream and listen to our podcast on all available platforms. So for now, sit back, tune in and enjoy the People Performance Podcast.
Coming up on this episode,
Lewis Pugh.
Lewis Pugh.
Lewis Pugh.
Lewis Pugh.
Lewis Pugh. 55-year-old Lewis Pugh.
I nearly drowned. I just couldn't breathe. I was gasping for air. And it just all happened so very, very quickly. I just couldn't hold myself on the surface. My legs were dragging. I couldn't turn my arms. The swim across the North Pole, the water there was minus 1.7. I mean, it's just unbelievably cold. It's impossible to explain to somebody what minus 1.7 degrees centigrade is like unless you actually get yourself into that water. Well, so the reason why I swim in just a pair of Speedos is because it's just for a number of reasons. You know, I'm trying to get world leaders to understand what is happening in these remote, very fragile places. So when I swam across the North Pole in 2007, I realized that if I swam in a wetsuit or dry suit, it just wouldn't get media attention in the same way as swimming in a pair of Speedos would.
So even in that scenario, you still wasn't waving the white flag and recognizing the danger and giving up. It took for one of your team to fish you out the water on the challenge.
Well, I did realize we were in a lot of trouble. Never forget this. He points up to Mount Everest and he says, "You cannot bully this mountain. You change or you drown."
So welcome to the People Performance Podcast with me, Martin Johnson. And today I am joined by an incredible guest, Lewis Pugh. Now, before I explain where I first saw Lewis, I just want to do a good job of the introduction. Then I'll get you in, Lewis, to add anything to it. But I'm going to read. This is the only time I'm going to read on the entire podcast. Lewis Pugh is a world-renowned endurance swimmer, ocean advocate, and inspirational speaker who has conquered some of the planet's most extreme waters, from the North Pole to the icy reaches of Antarctica. As a UN EP patron of the ocean, Lewis uses his extraordinary physical feats to campaign for the protection of our planet's most vulnerable ecosystems. What I'm really delighted about is at the 2026 Leadership Retreat at the Grove in Hertfordshire next year, Lewis is going to join us at T2 to share some powerful insights on all things courage, performance under pressure, leadership, and how we can adapt in rapidly changing environments. So Lewis, welcome to the People Performance Podcast. Did that do you justice? And would you add anything to that?
No, thank you so much. And yes, absolutely did me justice. Thank you.
You're welcome. I first observed Lewis. We had a conversation yesterday, 12 years ago, at a global conference I was at the time for my organization I was working for in Orlando. You took to the stage. At that time, Lewis, I had no clue who you was. And I was blown away. And 12 years on, I was like, got to get Lewis involved here at T2. So we've come full circle. And today on the podcast, I want to go anywhere we like with it, but really I want to pick your brains on something that I feel is something that you've demonstrated over your career and that you really probably have a lot of experience in, which is around this concept of purpose, motivations, mental toughness. And when you're taking on the challenges and endeavors you do, what is it that you're leaning upon? What is it that gets you through, as you will probably explain to us, some pretty challenging and horrific conditions at times? So yeah. I guess let's start there, Lewis. What is your purpose? Do you have one? I mean, that's a huge question straight away, but what's your views on purpose and what's yours?
Let me take you back 13 years ago, because I was appointed as the UN Environment Patron of the Oceans. And when the executive director of the United Nations Environment Program appointed me, he said, "Your role is very, very simple, Lewis. We would like you to be a voice for the world's oceans, for all the incredible wildlife in our oceans, and also be a voice for protecting them. And I couldn't have been given a simpler brief. So that's what I see my purpose, trying to protect the most precious part of our planet, which is our oceans.
Love that. Love that. And so that's then propelled you into a series of, let's be honest, Lewis, insane challenges and activities. I mean, you must be slightly mad, right? Or does sometimes you get in one of these situations and you think, what am I doing? Or does it never ever cross your mind?
Well, there's always a lot of planning and preparation for these swims. So some of these swimmers maybe take 5 years to actually prepare for. So, for example, when I did the first swim across the North Pole in 2007, it was 5 years of training before I got there. But then when you actually walk out onto the ice and you're about to get in the water, I remember thinking to myself, well, how did I get here? Well, the decision took place 5 years previously. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. What has been so far then? Because just for the audience, what you've done quite a lot of swims from polar ice caps to shark infested waters. What has been the most challenging and why?
So they're all challenging for different reasons. Some of them because they're so cold. For example, the swim across the North Pole, the water there was minus 1.7. I mean, it's just unbelievably cold. It's impossible to explain to somebody what minus 1.7 degrees centigrade is like unless you actually get yourself into that water. Um, some of them are very challenging because of what is in the water. For example, predators. So I recently did a swim around Martha's Vineyard, which wasn't a long swim. It was about 100 kilometers, but you got great whites in the water. And that certainly adds a certain tension and a certain stress to the waters. Some of them are very long. So, for example, I did the first swim along the length of the English Channel. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, about 1,800 people have swum across the English Channel. That's 33 kilometers, but nobody had swum the length of the English Channel, which isn't 33 kilometers, it's 528 kilometers. And I remember standing there on the beach just about to get in, and it's it's such a difficult thing to undertake because you just don't know whether you're going to make it. And so each one of these swims has a different issue which you have to grapple with and have to get through.
And am I right in saying, Lewis, that let's go back to purpose a second. Part of that very clear brief you was given all those years ago, and you took on that mantle. But is part of the purpose that by doing these swims in certain environments, you're sort of proving a point about environmental change as well? So it's like if I can do these swims in a pair of Speedos, whereas 50 years ago I would have maybe died of hypothermia or whatever it might be. Is that part of the reason why you do what you do to prove a point?
Well, so the reason why I swim in just a pair of Speedos is because it's just for a number of reasons. I'm trying to get world leaders to understand what is happening in these remote, very fragile places. So when I swam across the North Pole in 2007, I realized that if I swam in a wetsuit or dry suit, it just wouldn't get media attention in the same way as swimming in a pair of Speedos would. And so, having swum across the North Pole in a pair of Speedos, then every single subsequent swim, you're going to have to do it that way. I was urging world leaders to be courageous, to make the tough decisions. And that's why I also swam in just a Speedo. But I choose these places very, very specifically is to try and convey a message. So, for example, swimming across the North Pole, I'm swimming across an open patch of sea. This place should be frozen over and has been frozen over for thousands and thousands of years. Um, and so each one of these swims has a very, very simple message. The message when I swam the length of the English Channel was that we need to protect the waters around the UK. It's a very, very big island, but you start thinking about what we've done to the waters around the UK. I grew up in Plymouth, in England, on the south coast. When I was a young boy, there wasn't plastic pollution on the beaches. The oceans were bountiful with fish. Things have changed dramatically. So each one of these swims designed in a specific place with a very, very simple message. I do the swim, then afterwards is the hard yards where I have to try get the world leaders or the environment ministers to take the important action which we need.
Yeah, love that. When we spoke on the phone, me and you had quite a meaningful conversation about purpose and sense of purpose, and we said we both agreed. I think that there's a difference between the two, but you said something that really caught my attention. You said, "Yes, but Martin, with things like challenges, it's purpose that gets me in the water, but it's not the thing that's keeping me in it when it gets tough."
Yeah.
I thought that was quite interesting. So, could you explain a little bit more around what you mean about that? Obviously, the purpose of what you do and what you stand for, the driving force is getting you in. But when it's freezing cold and you have 50 kilometers to go and there's great white circling, right? What's keeping you in there? Because I'm fascinated by mental toughness and resilience under pressure. What is it that you're leaning upon, Lewis, in those times?
So when I swam across the North Pole, it was a 1 kilometer swim, which took me nearly 19 minutes. And the water is minus 1.7. And I'm diving in there to do a very, very simple thing. And that is to show world leaders that the Arctic is melting so much now that I can even swim there. Well, it was extraordinarily painful during that swim. On a pain level, which I'd never experienced before, and obviously extremely difficult. But you can hack things out for 19 minutes. When I swam the length of the English Channel, though, we're talking about a swim which was 528 kilometers, which took 49 days to complete. And you're going through storms, and you're swimming. When I swam across when I swam across Lime Bay, it was completely full with jellyfish. And they're the most unforgiving animals because they always get you straight in the face. You get them around your arms, you get them in your armpit, you're rubbing that poison in. Sometimes if you're very unlucky, you get them, in your groin, which is not where you want to get not where you want to get jellyfish. The point being is that for swims which are very, very long and very, very hard, yes, the purpose, trying to protect these waters, will get me in the water. But I can assure you that when I'm swimming across Lime Bay and there are jellyfish absolutely everywhere, do you know what I'm thinking about? I'm not thinking about protecting the English Channel. I'm not thinking about all the incredible wildlife that we need to protect. I'm just surviving. It's
Interesting.
just pure survival. And so I have to separate these two things out. When I'm doing the swim, I'm focusing on the swim. I'm swimming to the very best of my ability. I'm focusing on my stroke and making sure I'm avoiding predators and jellyfish and all these things. But the purpose, it's a guiding light. It's where I'm aiming towards. So I think there's a difference.
So fascinating. You mentioned survival. Evolutionary, we are built for three core functions of human existence. We talk a lot when we do our work here at T2 about this. Survival, we have to preserve self at all costs. We always have done. Continuation of the species, find a mate and reproduce. And thirdly, purpose. We need to, whilst we're on this planet, we need a sense of contribution and belonging. If we fulfill those three things, our brain can cope. We're pretty much can cope. But survival has two sides to it, doesn't it? It's fight or flight. And for many modern day humans, we live in a world of comfort where we often flight. If it gets tough, we get out of there, or we stop, or we give up. When you're doing these swims and you're at pure survival mode, the temptation to flight, to get on the boat, to stop, to bail out is there. So what is it that you're pulling upon that says, no, Lewis, fight, stay in the water?
When I started that swim, so this, just to explain, when you swim the length of the English Channel, it starts at Land's End and ends in Dover. 528 kilometers. Nobody had ever done it before. And I was interviewed at the beginning, and I said to the interviewer, I said, I've made 3 promises to my team this morning. I said, the first promise I've made them is that I'm going to leave all my doubt here at the beginning. I said, because it's natural that if you're going to attempt something like this, that you're going to have doubt. But if we have doubts, then we are never going to make it through this thing. So I said, I'm going to leave all my doubt here at the beginning. I said, the second promise I've made my team is that every single day I will swim 10 kilometers. We'll then mark the position on the map. We then go to shore, we sleep, and then the next day we go back there and carry on with the swim. And I said the third promise I have made my team is that if on a specific day it is just so rough and so dangerous, we can't even get out, the following day I'll do a double shift. I'll swim 20 kilometers. And you know what? Well, we started this swim and we went through a fair few storms. And there were some days where I had to do a double shift because I wasn't able to swim the day before. But eventually, after 49 days, we got to Dover. And I walked up the beach there, and there's a statue there to Captain Matthew Webb, who was the first person to swim across the English Channel, so a width of the English Channel. And underneath it is a quote by him where he says, "Nothing great is easy." That is absolute fact. Nothing great is easy. And so whatever you are trying to achieve, you're going to have your doubts. But I urge people to always remember these three things. Leave them at the beginning, dive in and take action every single day. And if you can't take action on a specific day because you're dealing with some other issue, which is equally as important, well, then the following day, you've got to be prepared to do a double shift. And if you do those three things, then really very, very few things are impossible to achieve. That's what I've learned.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Now, let me just dig into that, because what fascinates me when I listen intently, Lewis, is one thing jumps out at me there from a psychological perspective. What you created in those promises that you made was ultimate accountability.
Absolutely.
So you've created a high degree of personal accountability by making three promises, which means when you're in survival mode and your brain's saying flight, get out of there, you've made three promises, and your accountability level therefore is extremely high, making it difficult for you to give up in that endeavor. Is that just always been in you, a high degree of personal accountability, Lewis? Or has that been through your early experiences? Or where does that come from? Because not everybody has that, do they? Not everybody possesses
Mm.
high degrees of personal accountability.
I realized this was going to be a tough swim because if you're going to swim across the English Channel, you can choose the perfect day. You can sit in Dover and you can wait for the absolutely perfect day where it's flat as a mill pond, and then you're going to rush across in 10 hours or 15 hours, whatever the case may be. But I knew that we were going to have days when I was exhausted, or there were jellyfish, or there were storms. I knew that was going to take place. And so, yes, I was looking for that accountability. And I wanted my team to hold me to those promises each and every single day. I don't know whether I always had it, but I do try to keep my word. And so I didn't ever want to have a situation where I wasn't trying to keep my word.
Yeah. I'm right in saying you're South African, right, Lewis, of origin? I know you grew up in England, but how old was you when you moved from South Africa?
Well, so I'm half half, exactly half half. I went to school in both countries. I went to university in both countries. I was in the military in both countries. I've worked in both countries. But here's the interesting point. When I'm in South Africa, I feel very British. And when I'm here in Britain, I feel very South African. So I should probably just live in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So,
So
but I was 10 years old when we moved out to South Africa initially.
Right. So I guess a couple of things in there. South African makes perfect sense in terms of the culture in South Africa, but also probably parental influence is huge in terms of some of those early attributes within you forming. We talk a lot about the psychology of by the time we reach adult brain development, we are pretty much who we are to an extent. And largely that is built from three environments, Lewis. That's built from parental influence, the way our parents parented us, social exposure, so where we grew up, who we grew up with, the friends we knocked around with, the place we lived, the village or the estate or whatever it might be, and educational, the quality and ongoing access we had to education during that time. So that makes up a lot of your nurture, your environmental influence, whereas the rest of it's just pure genetics, your genetic coding. So
I
do you
find
think?
that
Sorry, go
yeah.
on with those.
I find that really, really interesting because so my father was a doctor in the Navy. My mother was a nurse in the Navy. But my father's real passion were antiques. And he used to collect these little sort of porcelain figures, which were made during the Victorian era. And he decided to write a book on it. And so every day he'd come back from the hospital and he'd sit down and he'd start writing. And I remember him sort of going into the study and writing. And then he'd have a draft and he'd give it to my mother, and my mother would type it. And she would take all the photographs. And they had an enormous collection, many, many thousands of pieces. And this book was a sort of labor of love between the two of them that they did. And it took them 7 years to complete this book. But I just saw that consistency that they never gave up, that they just kept chipping away each and every single day. And then eventually they produced this beautiful book. So I think I saw in our family that, you go for something, but you don't ever, ever give up. I think also swimming, though, it's a unique sport. And it's a unique sport because it's a sport where the goalposts can shift like nothing else. You can start doing an English Channel swim, so across the English Channel, and you can be just a few kilometers away from France, and a current comes along and it drags you all the way along that coast. You think you're going to do a 10-hour swim, and then suddenly it's a 15-hour swim, like that. Imagine in marathon running, imagine doing a marathon and you're just, 40 kilometers and you just got a little bit to get to the end. And the organizers come and say, hey, hold on, hold on. You got another 20 kilometers to go. But with swimming, what it does is it builds that grit because you know that things can shift. And so when they shift, you have to just keep calm and recalibrate and keep going towards the end.
So let me ask you a question on that. And I know you don't have to share too much on this, but we both served in the military, and the desensitization to stress, duress, and struggling through the basic training and ongoing advanced training you get in the military prepares you for stuff like that.
Yes.
How much do you think your military experience shaped you to set you up for success with these challenges and endeavors?
It was indispensable. And for or for many reasons, but one specifically, it's just you meet people from so many different backgrounds. You meet people who have come from the poorest of backgrounds, and some people who have come from incredibly privileged backgrounds. You meet people who have had very little formal education, and people who've got doctorates from Oxford University, whatever the case may be. And the interesting thing is, you meet so many different people, and then you begin to think about what type of people you would like to have in your team. And so when I left the military, I was always thinking, okay, what type of people do I want to have in my team? And I summed it up with just three different things. And when I put teams together and the people who got these three things, then very, very few things really do go wrong. The first thing I always look for is I look for people who have an unrelenting pursuit of excellence. That everything they do to the very, very best of their ability because we're in a very high consequence environment. And if something goes wrong, you know, I could lose my life, or even worse, somebody in the team could lose their life. So I'm looking for people who have that attention to detail, that they do things really as well as they can. I also look for people with a very specific mindset. Let me just take you through a range of personalities, and I'll tell you what really works in the polar regions and in the oceans, and what really doesn't work. On the most extreme left of society, you got your pessimists. Over here, you got your cynical people. In the middle, you got your realists. Over here, you got your optimists. And right over there, you got your daydreamers. I look for people who are realistic optimists. People who say, let's roll up our sleeves and let's give this a really good go because the reason why we're doing it is crucially important. And then lastly, I look for people who care. They care about themselves. They care about the reason why we're doing it, and they care about the person next to themselves. And And as I say, that when I choose teams based on those three criteria, you get really, really special people. And I think that's what the military really taught me, was how to choose really good teams of people.
I couldn't agree more, Lewis. I think that definitely mirrors my experience. I always say to people like this, because one of the things you didn't say in that list was, I want to be best friends with everybody I work with. It doesn't work like that. In the military, you don't have to be friends with people to trust them. And what I mean by that is, there's some people you served with where you wouldn't see them on weekends, and yet they're probably not in your phone book now. But if you were serving on a military operation or exercise, you could trust them 100% to do their job right next to you. And if needed, they would risk their life for you, and vice versa. And that's because they had some of the attributes you just described and some of the qualities that you just described. So I think there's a lot to be said. People generally in the corporate world hire people who are like whom, like themselves, or who I'm going to have rapport with and get on. And don't get me wrong, rapport is important, but are we looking for the deep-seated qualities required to perform when it really counts, to contribute and sacrifice for the team? And I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let me shift a little bit, Lewis, and ask you a question. You don't have to answer this, by the way, but I'm going to push you anyway. I've read a little bit about your endeavors, and a couple of them, you've had a few close shaves in terms of being in immediate or present danger. When I often talk to people about the three core functions of human existence, survival, reproduction, and purpose, I always make the flippant comment that in modern day life, not every day are we faced with true life or death situations. We once ran from saber-toothed tigers every day. We're quite comfortable these days. Um, but you genuinely have experienced a couple, I would say, if not a few more, of situations where you've probably felt in clear and present danger.
Mm.
Um, what would you say was the closest you got to that, or what was the worst time you experienced, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, there've been a few. Probably the most reported on was when I tried to do a swim on Mount Everest. So I was trying to do a swim in a glacial lake on Everest, to highlight just how the glaciers are melting. And these glaciers, they provide a constant water supply to India, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, some of the most important countries. They're absolutely essential, but they're melting away.
How far
And
up, Lewis? How far up Everest is this glacier?
we're at 5.5 kilometers above sea level, which is so difficult to breathe up there. And so I had done all the training in South America, high up in the Andes, in a very, very inhospitable place. Anyway, I went up onto Everest, and a similar height where I had been training in the Andes, and I dived into the water, and well, I nearly drowned. I just couldn't breathe. I was gasping for air, and it just all happened so very, very quickly. I just couldn't hold myself on the surface. My legs were dragging. I couldn't turn my arms. I was very lucky because I was near the edge. The leader of the expedition, he grabbed me, he pulled me out the water, and he said, "We're taking off this mountain right now."
So even in that scenario, you still wasn't waving the white flag and recognizing the danger and giving up. It took for one of your team to fish you out the water on the challenge.
Well, I did realize we were in a lot of trouble. I
Right.
had done a test swim 3 days beforehand, which was 300 meters below. And at that altitude, everything was fine. I could swim absolutely comfortable, go up just another 300 meters, and that was the difference. I just couldn't breathe. As I say, I was gasping for air. Anyway, what's the lead of this expedition? He used to be a general in the British Army. He said, "You've got to change, Lewis." He said, "You change or you will drown." And he said, "So instead of swimming crawl, I want you to swim breaststroke so you can breathe." We're 5.5 kilometers above sea level. It's so difficult to breathe up there. He says, "I want you to be breathing." But he said, "The most important thing is I want you to be swimming as slowly as you can." He said, "I need you to preserve your oxygen." And normally what I do is I swim as quickly as I can to be able to get through the swim, to be able to get out the water. He said, "No, no, no, no. You can handle this cold. I need you to swim as slowly as you can." And then lastly, never forget this. He points up to Mount Everest and he says, "You cannot bully this mountain." You change or you drown. And so 2 days later, we went back up there and we did this swim, uh, breaststroke, slow, with humility, and we were able to successfully do it. But the reason why I tell you this story is because you have to have a culture of adaptability in your team. So we didn't change what the mission was. The mission was very, very simple. It was to do a swim high up in the Himalayas on Mount Everest to highlight how important these glaciers are and how important this source of water is for humanity. But the way we're going to do it may have to change. I never ever thought that I'd be doing breaststroke on Mount Everest, but we did it. We were able to get that message across.
Love that. One of the other things I pick up in there, Lewis, is look, you're an ex-military guy, South African, strong. Clearly, you're a presence. Clearly, strong-minded. But you had to be able to take feedback from another individual in that moment and not put your shield up. You had to be willing to be challenged, and that's I always say that's the precursor to adaptability. You cannot adapt if you're not willing to listen. And so I
Right.
think that's an important lesson. I mean, do you take feedback and pushback easy? Does it feel uncomfortable, or is it a case of when my life's on the line, I have to listen? You know?
Yeah. I think it was so clearly evident that I had to change there. It's other circumstances where you're not quite sure whether you need to change. That becomes more difficult, and you're hearing lots of different advice. Leadership can be a very, very lonely place. We're
Yeah,
going through enormous change right now.
yeah,
And even in my team, we're arguing about, what's the right way of dealing with these various big issues which we're facing with. And often the advice from various members of the team are very, very different. But you have to have an environment where everybody feels that they can stand up and have a voice and be heard.
yeah. And but that takes for you to allow that to happen without, I see leaders all the time where they go, "Yeah, I want you to challenge me. I want everybody to challenge me. Don't, regardless of my command position, command authority or rank, challenge me." And then when it happens, the shield comes up and the behaviors. You've got to practice what you preach. You've got to genuinely put it on the table and say, "I think this, but am I right? Am I right?" And if you do that, you open your mind up to be challenged, which then leads to your ability to adapt as a leader or as a team. It's an incredibly important thing. Awesome. Um, I'm interested, Lewis, around teams. So you mentioned earlier about the military taught you a lot about building teams. Um, but there's an old saying, isn't it? If you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. What are some of the other principles of high performing teams and teamship that you've learned along your way in your endeavors?
Mm. Remember, I talked to you about those three things that I was always looking for. I think the one which has saved us so many times is this unrelenting pursuit of excellence, that everything we do to the very, very best of our ability. I did this from recently around Martha's Vineyard. So
That's,
Martha's
by the way,
Vineyard,
Lewis, that is Martha's Vineyard the place where Jaws was filmed? Am I right in saying that?
yes, correct. So this year was the 50th anniversary of Jaws and was filmed in Martha's Vineyard. And the waters around Martha's Vineyard have actually become a great white hotspot. So the numbers of great whites have rebounded, and there are, an awful lot of great whites in the water.
So when you're
When you,
swimming, sorry, Lewis, when you're swimming, you have goggles on, right?
yes, correct. I have
So,
goggles.
so can you see sharks?
The interesting thing about the waters around Martha's Vineyard is they are really, really dark.
Which is even more
So
scary, right? Because you know they're there.
you know you know they're there, but you can barely see the end of your hand.
Oh, that must be so
And
frightening.
yeah, and so everything we did, to the very, very best of our ability. The safety kayaker is right next to me. The people on the boat, they're out there in stormy conditions on many of the days, stormy conditions. And it's easy to just for that one moment not switch on. And then that's when something can happen. But all of them were had this unrelenting pursuit of excellence, the boat driver trying to get the best course, the photographer sitting there and trying to get that magic picture which can tell the story, the kayaker right next to me, everybody doing that. I think it saved us so many times, um,
Yeah.
during a career of nearly 40 years.
Wow. Let me shift a little bit, and then I'm going to come back to my final few questions on leadership. And I'm going to ask you for the typical question I ask everybody on the podcast, which is, who is the greatest leader you've ever worked with and why? However, before we come back to that, we at T2, I wrote it in my second book called I Am Human Pain and Pleasure. And I wrote an entire chapter about generational shift because it
Mm.
fascinates me around the current societal position we are in now, with all of these world events, with all of these issues that we face for the future, whether it's environmental change and climate, whether it's political standpoints and the polarization between left and right, whether it's, the AI advancement and what that means for the future generations. We're at a really, really pivotal time. We also have 4 or 5 generations operating in the world at one time because people are living longer than ever. And so I wrote about generational shift, and I said a lot around polarization, fueled by mis and disinformation in the world, fueled by social media and the technology revolution. And I was saying that if we've got a fighting chance for future generations of moving forward and solving some of these issues, we have to reduce polarization. We have to come together and see things for how they are, not better, not what, nor worse. But we face a huge challenge with that for the number of reasons I've said. Would you agree with that? Because come the day you're done, Lewis, you hope that your work counts for something. You hope that the next generations can take that and do something about it, but it's going to take for us to come together. Do you often think about that challenge yourself, and what are your thoughts on that? I know that's a really big question on the spot, by the way.
Yes, so it's very interesting. I serve as the UN Environment Patron of the Oceans. There are 196 nations at the United Nations, and they certainly don't all see eye to eye on many issues. Okay. And trying to get them to come together to protect the environment is a very, very uphill task. It really is. I mean, I have personal experience in this. Is I was trying to create a protected area down in Antarctica in a place called the Ross Sea. And under international law, 26 nations, or so 25 nations plus the European Union, who have scientific stations down there, all had to agree. All of them had to agree to these protective measures. And, obviously there's some countries there who don't see eye to eye. You've got the United States of America, you've got Russia and Ukraine, you've got Britain and Argentina, you've got Chile and Argentina. These countries have got long-standing issues between each other. Now you're trying to get them in there to protect this one precious planet of ours. We were very, very lucky. We were able to persuade them. But one of the most important things is you have to learn how to listen to the dialogue of the other side. And I think growing up in South Africa, that was a very, very good lesson, because at the end of apartheid, we learned in South Africa that you have to learn to listen to the dialogue of the other side. You don't have to agree to it, but you have to learn how to listen to it, because if we didn't, there would be bloodshed on an unprecedented level. And so when it comes to negotiations, that's what I try to bring to the table. We have to learn to listen to each other.
Lewis, I think that's such a poignant thing to say on this podcast episode, because I totally agree. And the challenge we have with that is polarization, the mis and disinformation reinforcing people's narratives, whether it's the argument against religion versus science, or the left versus right, or climate change or hoax, or vaccine, anti-vaccine. And we can go on and go on about these contentious issues where people become polarized because clever algorithms just serve up information that reinforces your deep-seated narrative. And we therefore don't put it in the middle to challenge it. And we don't listen to the other side with the intent to at least understand. I think
Yeah.
that's one of the biggest challenges our future generations are going to face in the world
Yeah.
that they're growing up in. And hopefully, and challenges like yours, purposes like yours, Lewis, messages like yours are going to hopefully make people stop and think, if nothing
Thank
else.
you. Yeah.
Right, final question, because honestly, I could keep you on this all day, but I want to save some of you back for the retreat in 2026. I want people to watch this and then go, I'm booking on because I want to see Lewis live in the flesh and get to engage with him on that evening. Leadership. Before I ask you for an example of the best leader you've ever worked with, do you have a philosophy on leadership at all, Lewis, or do you think leadership is entirely situational to the context, the team, the task? There's many different ways to do it. What would your rough overall philosophy be on leadership?
I don't know, because I've seen so many different types of leaders, so I've been through a number of different sort of a transition during my career. I started out as a swimmer. I became a maritime lawyer. I became an ocean advocate, and now I'm a sort of an environmental diplomat. And so I've seen leaders in all those spheres, great swimming coaches, great military leaders. I've seen, fantastic people in law who just have the great strategic mind, and then diplomats who are just able to bring people together to crystallize the issue and then find the middle ground. Um, uh, you were asking me the sort of who's the great leader that
Yeah,
I
let's
have
go into
worked.
that. Give me one example then of a great leader you remember particularly and why?
So it would probably be Jose Maria Figueres. He used to be the president of Costa Rica, and Costa Rica is a little bit of a superpower when it comes to the environment. So he was so special, or is so special. He's still working today. He was able to bring people together, and he has this a magnetism. He had huge amounts of charisma, but probably the my father sadly got Alzheimer's disease when I was very, very young, and so my mother had to bring myself and my sister up pretty much on her own. I think probably my mother would be the greatest leader. It's very easy in sport to see parents who are pushing their children, or sometimes actually holding their children back. My mother did neither of the two. She didn't push me. She didn't try hold me back. Even when I said I'm going to try swim across the North Pole, she didn't try hold me back. But what she did do, and this is why I just think she was the best, was she was always there to support me. I thought that's the sort of greatest type of leader you can have.
Lewis, I can't think of a better way to end this podcast episode than that. And genuinely, I've loved every single minute of this 40 odd minutes with you. And what I'm really looking forward to is collaborating with you at the retreat next year and finally meeting you in person. Um, it's been wonderful hearing about a few things today. If people want to engage a little bit more or hear a little bit more, and I know you and I, Lewis, need to work out what we talk about on that evening and how we're going to position it. But if people want to hear a little bit more, I would encourage you to book onto the retreat next year. It's July the 7th to the 9th at the Grove Resort in Hertfordshire. And and a chance to engage in live Q&A towards the end with Lewis as well. So other than that, Lewis, I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much for your time, by the way.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to spending time with you and your colleagues.
Awesome. And we'll be back shortly with another People Performance podcast.
The People Performance Podcast, brought to you by T2.